In Vladimir Putin's recent speech, he claimed that the Ukraine was created by the Bolshevik or the USSR. He claimed that the very idea of the Ukrainian statehood is a fiction. As someone who watches a lot of YouTube history channels, I feel like I'm qualified enough, and I think my opinion matters here. So, in my opinion, Vladimir Putin's claim is false. It's an extreme claim even by the standards of a former KGB agent turned tyrant who has declared the Soviet Union's collapse the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Contrary to the claim of Mr. Putin, Ukraine is a nation with a rich history and a diverse people. When you walk the streets of Kyiv, you are surrounded by historic buildings going back centuries. You see the majestic golden domes of the Orthodox Church, and you are surrounded by people who come from everywhere. Enough of the introduction, let's look at the history of Ukraine and see if Mr. Putin's claim has any weight to it. In the 7th century BC, a people group known as the Scythians lived in what is now modern-day Ukraine. Later, the Greeks landed on the Black Sea's north shore and established city-states. In the 5th and 6th century AD, Slavs arrived in Ukraine. Then in the 9th century, Swedish kings sailed along the Dnieper River in the heart of the Eastern Europe. Some of them settled and made Kiev their home, but no permanent settlement was created. This would all change when Kiev was taken by a Viking called Oleg in 882. Kiev was then made capital of the new Kievan Novgorodian state. The Rurik dynasty was established in the 10th century, and under Vladimir I, Ukraine converted to Christianity, ushering in a golden period in Ukrainian history. Vladimir I was baptized in Crimea, and it's in Crimea where he adopted Orthodox Christianity. Kievan Rus reached its peak under Yaroslav the Wise, and Kiev became Eastern Europe's chief political and cultural center. The state, however, disintegrated in the 11th and 12th centuries. In 1240, the Mongols, led by Batu, Genghis Khan's grandson, seized southern and eastern Ukraine, causing disaster. Northern and western Ukraine, on the other hand, remained autonomous until the 14th century, when it was conquered by the Poles and Lithuanians. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth established a Greek Catholic Church during their reign. The consequence of this reign is still visible, as the southwest of Ukraine is still Catholic, although the rest of the country is mainly Orthodox. The Mongols or Tatars were eventually driven back. However, the Tatars retained control of Crimea until the 15th century, when they were conquered by the Ottoman Empire. Some Serbs fled Polish landlords in the 15th and 16th centuries and lived on Ukraine's steppes. They were known as Cossacks, which roughly translates to free men. The Cossacks organized themselves into self-governing groups. They eventually merged to form the Cossack Hetmanate, which was led by a Hetman general. In the 17th century, Poland came to dominate western Ukraine, while Russia dominated eastern Ukraine. Then in the 18th century, Catherine the Great, Empress of Russia, was determined to absorb eastern Ukraine into Russia. The Cossack Hetmanate was abolished in 1764. Meanwhile, in the 18th century, Poland was declining. And in 1772 to 1795, Russia and Austria decided to help themselves to Polish territory. Most of modern-day Ukraine was taken by Russia, except for a small strip in the far west, which went to Austria. Finally, in 1783, Russia conquered Crimea. And also it was during this time that the port city of Odessa was founded by Catherine the Great. Habsburg-run Galicia encouraged the existence of Ukrainian political organization in order to counterbalance the influence of Polish culture. And as a result, Ukraine saw a rise in national cultural reawakening that then leads to the development of Ukrainian literature, education, and national identity. But at the same time, in Russian-conquered Ukraine, the use of the Ukrainian language was banned. In the 19th century, Ukraine was firmly under Russian control. But from the mid-19th century, nationalism spread around Europe. In 1918, while Russia was engaged in a bloody civil war, Ukraine became independent for a short time. However, in 1921, after the stabilization of Russia, Bolshevik forces forced Ukraine to become a part of the Soviet Union. Stalin decided that farms in Ukraine should be collectivized. In other words, peasants would be deprived of their land and livestock, and they would be made to work as farm laborers on land now owned by the state. Not surprisingly, many Ukrainian peasants bitterly resisted, even slaughtering their own livestock, rather than handing it over to the state. Stalin was determined to crush the Ukrainian peasants. In 1932, collective farms were given completely unrealistic quotas to fill. Soviet law decreed that the peasants would not be allowed to keep any grain until they had met their quotas. Many of the experienced farmers were deported by Stalin, and as a result, the farmers could not, of course, meet their quotas. So Soviet officials simply confiscated all the grain they wanted, leaving the peasants to starve. How many people died in this man-made famine is not known for sure, but it was probably between 3 to 7 million. This horrific artificial famine is called the Holodomor and is recognized as genocide by 16 UN members. However, Ukraine's suffering was not over yet. During 1937 to 1939, Stalin unleashed purges in which many Ukrainians were executed or sent to prison camps. Then in 1941, the Germans invaded Eastern Europe. During this period, Ukrainian Nationalist Army, which was led by Stefan Bandera, sided with the Nazis and killed and imprisoned many Polish, Gypsies, Jews and Russians in Ukraine. The Ukrainian nationalists saw Nazi Germany as a liberator from Stalin's rule. They thought the Nazis would give them an opportunity to create an Ukrainian state. But Hitler didn't have any plans to create an independent Ukraine. As Ukraine was the breadbasket of Europe, Hitler thought the rich dark soil and the vast fields of wheat in Ukraine would solve Germany's ration issues. Many sources estimate that around 5.2 million Ukrainians died as a result of the Nazi occupation. With the help of 5 million strong Ukrainian soldiers, USSR recaptured Ukraine. Afterwards, Stalin took reprisals against anyone he suspected of being disloyal or of collaborating with the Germans, and as a result, many Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars were deported. In order to replace the now deported Tatars, USSR promoted Russification of the Crimean Peninsula. During this period, many Russians settled in the Crimean Peninsula, making the peninsula heavily Russian. In 1954, Crimea was handed to Ukraine to commemorate the 300th anniversary of the reunification of Ukraine with Russia, and also to rebuild it and supply it with fresh water through our canal in Ukraine. This same canal was blocked by Ukraine after the 2014 invasion of the Crimean Peninsula by Russia. In 1986, there was a disaster at the nuclear power plant at Chernobyl. The authorities tried to cover up the disaster and it caused much resentment among the Ukrainians. In the late 1980s, Ukrainians became increasingly dissatisfied with the rule from Moscow. And in 1989, Ukrainian People's Movement for Restructuring was formed, and in 1990 demonstrations were held. With the collapse of communism and the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine once more became independent. Many deported Crimean Tatar returned to their homes in Crimea. After the collapse of the USSR, things like the armed forces, industries and administration were divided, and whatever was in your territory remained in your territory. This meant the now independent states like Belarus, Kazakhstan and Ukraine got to keep their nuclear weapons. During this time, Ukraine had the third largest nuclear arsenal, behind Russia and the US. Belarus and Kazakhstan decided to immediately give up their nuclear arsenal, but Ukraine was thinking about keeping it. However, the transition from communism to capitalism was a painful one for the Ukrainian people. Ukraine was suffering from high inflation and economic decline. In an effort to revive its economy and get aid that was frozen, and also not to upset everyone, like everyone, Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal. However, before they gave up their nukes, the former three Soviet republics had signed the Budapest Memorandum, which meant the territorial integrity of these three countries would be respected. It was just a promise and not a defensive treaty. Seeing how things played out in the future, this decision might be the costliest decision of the modern day state of Ukraine. The transition from dictatorship to democracy also did not go smoothly for the Ukrainians. Being pro-Russia and pro-EU became a fundamental dividing line in Ukrainian politics. In late 2004, pro-Russia candidate Viktor Yanukovych won the presidential election. However, many people believed the election was rigged, and the supporters of the EU-friendly candidate Viktor Yushchenko held demonstrations for 10 days. Eventually, a rerun was held, and in early 2005, Yushchenko was elected as the president of Ukraine. These protests in favor of the EU-friendly candidate was called the Orange Revolution. In my opinion, it was because of this revolution Russia started looking at Ukraine with suspicion and hostility. Ukraine was one of the most deeply affected countries in the economic downturn of 2008. Its economy shrank by 15%, but that was temporary and Ukraine recovered. In 2010, Russia-friendly candidate Viktor Yanukovych once again ran for the office, and this time he won the election. But in 2013 and 14, a wave of demonstrations swept across Ukraine when President Yanukovych rejected an association treaty with the EU. These protests were largely peaceful in nature, but the then President Yanukovych handled it with brute force, and as a result, there were 240 casualties.
All that is taking place today is vandalism, a crime, and a staged revolt.
In February 2014, the Ukrainian parliament voted to remove Yanukovych from power. After the new elections, Petro Poroshenko became president of Ukraine. After a few days of the election, armed men seized parliament in the Ukrainian region of Crimea and raised the Russian flag. Russia had successfully invaded the Crimean Peninsula. Putin cited the history in justifying his seizure of Crimea, a land he called sacred to Russia. As I earlier talked about it, this is where Vladimir the Great adopted orthodoxy. But Russia didn't stop there. In an effort to further destabilize Ukraine, Russia funded a pro-Russian separatist in the eastern region of the Donbas region of Ukraine. This region then declared independence from Ukraine. This war has claimed the lives of more than 15,000 people on both sides.
But the dispute between the two countries is more than territorial. Another issue is religion. Most of the churches in Ukraine have been under the authority of the Russian Orthodox Church for well over 300 years. But now that authority is in dispute.
In an attempt to be more politically, economically, and religiously independent from Russia, Ukraine's Orthodox Church split from its Russian counterpart in 2018. In 2019, former President Petro Poroshenko, in an attempt to increase his popularity, signed a bill making Ukrainian the only state and official language in Ukraine. This meant you can only use Ukrainian during the operation of duties and state power and local self-government. This law was passed one day after Moscow allowed residents of separatist territories in East Ukraine to apply for Russian nationality. This law further increased the East-West divide in Ukraine, as more than 75% of Ukrainians speak Russian in eastern regions. I would like to conclude this video by saying that the statement made by Putin is completely incorrect. He subscribes to a revisionist history of the 19th century Russian Empire. In 19th and 20th century, there was a rise in nationalism in Europe. The leaders in empirical Russia were closely observing this new trend. French and German people wanted to create one language and one culture out of different dialects, languages, and traditions. Their end goal was to assimilate the different people and ultimately unify them with the wider culture. So in order to assimilate the minorities, many countries culturally genocided the minorities. The Russian Empire too subscribed to this ideology. They had an ideology of a big Russian or Slavic nation, with maybe different tribes, but basically they are the same nation, speaking same language and following same culture. With these ridiculous revisionist claims of Mr. Putin, we are practically back to the mid-19th century, when imperial officials attempted to stifle the growth of Ukrainian culture and ideas.
The train now approaching platform 2 is the London Underground, service to Harrow and Maidstone, calling out